Welcome learners. We have been discussing about the industrial labor in post-colonial India from the previous session. In this module, it is going to be about the urban economy and the factory workers. In a generally accepted view, the economic development of underdeveloped countries is contingent upon the introduction of the industry. Industrialization, in turn, is associated with the urban growth, and the relationships of these two processes is usually assumed to be a close that some writers speak of industrialization and urbanization as two facts of one and the same process. The evidence for the need for industrialization and urbanization is found in the historical experience of economically more advanced countries and in general consideration on the economic situation of the farm population in many underdeveloped countries. The advanced countries contain the most heavily industrialized and at the same time most densely urbanized regions of the world, and to the extent to which industrial cities have grown up in the underdeveloped countries, they have been patterned after British, German and American models. The improvement in the economic position of the subsistent farmers, who make up 2/3 of or more of the people in many underdeveloped countries, is dependent upon industrialization. There are scarcely any underdeveloped countries in which there is not a large surplus of unemployed agricultural labor. This surplus farm labor represent a tremendous waste of human resources, and the obvious remedy is the transfer of these redundant persons into industry. But their removal from their farms may not always be sufficient and may have to be implemented by removal from the villages to urban areas. With this small introduction, we shall look into the objective of this session. In this session, we shall study about the factory workers as a dominant class in the urban economy, the recruitment and the mode of their employment. In this session, we will be studying about the social composition and the lifestyle of the working class in the next session. Factory workers as a dominant class in the urban economy. The growth of India's modern proletariat was largely an urban phenomena. The new towns and cities as well as the existing urban centers became the sites of a great diversity of industrial enterprises. Jute and cotton mills had long been of vital significance to Calcutta, Mumbai and Ahmedabad. Of much more recent origin was the emergence of heavy industries in the public sector economy, in particularly the manufacture of iron and steel for the production of capital goods for machine and construction workshops, petrochemical enterprises, cement factories, the manufacture of cars and other form of transport, military equipment, shipping buildings, etc. The second 5-year plan implemented in 1956 had prioritized the expansion of industrial infrastructure. The new public sector industrial workforce soon acquired a distinct character. The benefits of jobs within its inclined security of employment and various social provisions like housing, health and education, which were often the envy of the workers in private enterprises. It is therefore hardly surprising that such workers became the reference point in the collective actions of the industrial labor at large. While the relations of the production initiated in these new government enterprises helped to give the labor a new dignity. The 1969 report of the National Commission on Labor elaborated on the characteristics of this new type of the factory worker. The social composition of labor is undergoing a change. Labor is not restricted to certain castes and communities. social mobility today accounts for the emergence of a mixed industrial workforce. While in the traditional industries, this change is slow. One cannot escape noticing it in sophisticated employments such as engineering and metal trades, oil refining and distribution, chemicals and petrochemicals, machine tools and machine buildings, and the synthetics and in many white-collar occupations. The background of the intermediate and lower cadres in the latter industry is overwhelming urban. Their level of education is higher. They come from middle or lower middle classes comprising small shopkeepers, petty urban landlords, lower echelons of the public service and school teachers and professional groups. They have pronounced polyglot character. In what follows, we will look in turn at the recruitment, mode of employment and the social composition and the lifestyle of the segment of the working class. Recruitment. According to the colonial stereotype, the workforce which flowed straight from the village to the factory gate had little, if any, direct contact with the management. Workers were recruited by the jobbers who were frequently charged with the control on the work floor. Combining the functions of the recruitment and supervision, the middleman was sometimes also responsible for the housing and feeding of his workers. The physical, economic and social gap that had to be bridged was so crucial that the jobber is justifiably described as the midwife of the India's industrialization. But one of the first changes to occur started around the turn of the century was the transfer of the recruitment from the hinterland to the factory itself. Increasing pressure on subsistence resource as a result of the population growth and land alienation accelerated the flow of poor farmers and non-agrarian workers to the cities where the industrial employment gained new impetus during and after the World War II. The role of the jobber declined from being an intermediary between the worker and management, leader of the gang of the workers whom he had himself brought together. He became a foreman charged with implementing orders from above. The hiring of the workers is becoming the responsibility of the employment office and the labor officer in the beginning to take over the welfare and service activities of the Sardar. The decline of the jobber went hand in hand with the introduction of new rules which obliged major industrial enterprises to professionalize their personal practices and which eventually led to his disappearance. But if selection procedures become more impersonal, can we infer those qualities based on the individual achievement experience, training, social skills have replaced those based on the ascription? Economic logic and the interest of the employer would suggest that they should. Thus, Papolo dismissed the suggestion that caste, religion, custom or tradition might be crucial. But in fact, it is clear that they continue to play a very large part. From the employer's point of view, recruitment mediated by existing workers helps to stabilize performance in daily production. Recruitment through the present employees according to the prevail. According to the evidence before, employers prefer this method to improve the morale of the workers. In some companies, labor management agreements specify entitlement to a percentage of vacancies to close relatives of the senior employees. In a few cases, both the employer and the union maintain rosters of people so eligible for employment. Recruitment through advertisement is restricted mainly to supervisory and white collar employments and is being increasingly used to tap skilled labor. For occupations which do not require skills, an arrangement by which workers appear at the factory gate in the hope of getting employment still operates. The widespread use of relatives, neighbors and friends in order to influence those who have jobs to bestow testifies to the enormous disparity between supply and the demand. So great is the latter that applicants without such contacts stand no chance at all. Some authors have seen the vitality of such particularistic mechanism as a carryover from the traditional prescription of the kin solidarity, and Sheth noted the continuity between the patronage found in the factory and the values of the world outside it. But in any event, it is now hard to believe that particularism can be simply equated with the earlier or lower stage in an unilinear transformation along a continuum that eventually culminates in the universities and globalized civilization. The Japanese example is instructive. Rather than emphasizing its continuity with older social and cultural forms, others would see such behavior in more universalistic terms as a common response to a situation of extreme scarcity which prompts the people to put pressure on the kin who are more favorably placed. But whichever way it is, the facts are not in doubt. Papalo summarized a series of studies from different parts of the country as follows. In over 2/3 of the cases, the workers got information about the availability of jobs from friends, relatives and neighbors. Employment exchanges were the source of the information to a very small extent, ranging from 1.5% in Bombay to 10.6% in Coimbatore, though 20% of the workers in Ahmedabad and 25% in Pune had registered with the exchanges. Newspaper advertisements provided information about their jobs to 1.5% of the workers in Bombay, 2.2% in Pune and 10.6% in the Coimbatore. Jobs were secured on the basis of recommendation or introduction by friends, relatives and persons of the same region and caste, generally employees of the same factory, in 67% of the cases in Pune and in 61% of cases in Ahmedabad, Bombay and Coimbatore. Placements through employment exchanges accounted for 2% of jobs in Pune and Ahmedabad. Many factory workers attribute their access to the coveted arena of employment in more veiled terms to coincidence or good luck. Such terminology quite incorrectly gives the impression of an unexpected windfall, a mere stroke of fortune. It is a emphasis for claims made on their more fortunate fellows for help. Mode of employment. Much of the work on the Indian industry has been based on the survey data, questionnaires and formal interviews. In earlier studies, there were seldom much personal contact with the workforce. Singer's essay on the Indian joint family in modern industry was based on the family histories of 19th outstanding industrial leaders in Madras city. The next generation of researchers did actually descend to the level of the workers, but their contact with them rarely went beyond brief one-off encounters. The exceptions were studies of more anthropological nature, like that of Uma Ramasamy, who lived in an area populated by the factory workers during her field work. What is also lacking is the documentation that originates from the workers themselves, diaries, biographies or even oral histories. nor has research usually focused on the workplace, often no doubt as a consequence of management suspicions combined with some skepticism about its tangible benefits to the company. The researchers too have had their prejudices and inhibitions, one reporting that questions regarding the trade unions were avoided because these existed the workers too much. Sheth is still unusual in having managed to move freely inside the factory, to ask whatever he liked and to observe the daily work cycle, all on the understanding that would stick to academic business and would cause no trouble in the administration of the factory. But the blessings of the management may of course result in antagonism and distrust among the workers. Sheth said that it is all very well. You are doing good work which may benefit us in the long run, but we don't know our employers' tactics. But I am sure that if your contains anything of these masters, they will buy up all the copies of the books to prevent others from reading it. All your labour will then prove futile. That the majority of the accounts of the factory labour are based on the contacts with the employees outside the factory explains why ethnographies of the work process and hierarchy are still comparatively rare. The social mobility mentioned in the 1969 NCL report assumes the possibility of the progress up the occupational ladder. The picture presented by most studies, however, is one of the little task differentiation. Lombard found that in the 5 factories he investigated, 75 to 90% of all the workers were rated as unskilled or semi-skilled, and the majority were doing the same jobs as they had started with. The unskilled category in particular, varying from 1/3 to 3/4 of the workforce, was distinguished by an almost complete lack of mobility. It is therefore hardly surprising that roughly 3 in 5 workers did not expect any promotion and considered their present position to be as high as they could get. As this suggests, the idea that factory work is skilled is only to be a very limited degree true. In many enterprises, roughly 1/4 of the workforce belong to the supervisory and maintenance staff. The former act as bosses on the work floor and do not directly participate in the production process. The maintenance staff are indispensable but not important. As cleaners, guards, messengers or general dogs bodies, they occupy the lowest ranks in the factory hierarchy. Between these two poles are the production workers, about 3/4 of the total workforce, who are split into two sections: operators, who are assumed to be skilled workers, and the subordinate helpers, who function as their less skilled sidekicks and substitutes. The progressive mechanization of the production means that a higher percentage of workers than in the past now regularly or continuously handle machines to whose regime they have to subject themselves. But this does not necessarily mean that their work is more skilled. Much of it is monotonous and makes no demands of craft competence. In fact, induction into the factory force may even result in a loss of the skills. If the prospects of the promotion up the factory hierarchy are limited, we might expect workers to try to realize their aspiration by moving sideways into other enterprises. But by contrast with the lack of commitment stereotype the greatest majority show extreme entrenchment. None less than Myers discovered that they tend to cling at all cost to the job they have got. Absenteeism is high, but horizontally mobility is rare by contrast with the USA. Or as Lombard put it in terms that will by now be familiar, a factory job is a form of property to the workers. He will seek to retain but not improve it. The worker's status in the general society seems not to be increased by upward occupational mobility within the factory. While the early literature complained about the lack of commitment, the problem was now defined as one of the workers who behaved as though they were clients who could not be dismissed by their patron employers and who showed no inclination to their work or find another job. Undercommitment had mysteriously metamorphosed into overcommitment. Uma Ramasamy reached a more balanced conclusion. On the one hand, most of the workers expect to retire in the factories they first joined unless better opportunities present themselves elsewhere, which is unusual. They increasingly looked at their job not only as a right but also as a property to be passed on to their children through varisu, a hereditary transaction. All these find their reflection in the low turnover in the workforce. But she is on the other hand clear that this is not a simple product of the power of custom or of inescapable culture determinism. It is rather the consequence of a quest for a maximum security in an insecure world in which it is a lack of permanent employment which is the norm. The attributes of factory workers in permanent employment have to be seen in the context of very substantial labor reserve retained by most enterprises. What is striking is how many researchers have focused on this rather peripheral category of badly workers, that is the regular substitutes who report to the factory daily, while largely ignoring the much larger numbers of floating casual workers. A UNESCO survey of factory employment in various Indian states unblushingly says that the short tenure factory workers and the non-factory workers had to be left out. Though the Badly's presence is required to replace permanent workers who are absent, this does not always mean that management is able to send them away again when they report at the stipulated time and there is no work. Their more or less continuous involvement in the flexible organized work process long beyond any reasonable trial period is often essential to the management. Their lack of formal work contracts, however, gives the employers the freedom to minimize their rights. In South Gujarat, repeatedly encountered people who had worked for the same boss on a temporary basis or for more than 10 years without ever giving up hope of eventually being rewarded with a permanent job in turn for their loyalty. The size of the labor reserve varies by enterprise. In the 5 factories studied by the Lombard, 10 to 20% of the workforce belong to that category. In Shett's study, almost 1/5, though this did not include the casual workers who were hired and fired according to the needs. 2 subcontractors were charged with hiring these casuals. Each morning, the manager gave instructions as to how many extra workers were needed that day and the two labor contractors would admit them at the factory gates. On average, they numbered 70 or 80 men, representing another 10% of the total labor. The contractors were paid piece rates and neither they nor the gangs under them appeared on the factory books. First, the contractors deducted their own generous cut and then paid their teams. This floating reserve, completely without rights, was not only called upon for all kind of odd jobs, but also to take the place of regular labourers who had not reported for work. Armstrong's Bangalore study revolved around the idea that those fortunate enough to have found factory employment had crossed the threshold to a secure existence. The contrast was with the precariousness of the life outside. Once inside the citadel with a job to fall back on improving one's qualification and getting promotion becomes a gradual process, a matter of more or less faster or permanent job or not having any one. In the view of Jan Bremen, however, Armstrong pays too little attention to the considerable and often lasting the gap between temporary and permanent workers, appearing to suggest that passing from the former to the latter category is in most cases nothing more than a matter of time and patience. Even educated Brahmins will take unskilled casual factory work in the hope of permanent jobs. Once inside the citadel, a man can look around for alternatives if he wants. The idea that upward mobility is a common career pattern is not confirmed by other studies. In fact, temporary workers often get no further than the bottom of the work hierarchy. Although better half than the labor nomads beyond the factory gates, they can make no claims on the secure conditions of employment enjoyed by permanent hands and are usually assigned the lowliest and most unskilled course. Even when the work is the same, they are paid for less than the permanent employees. Further, Lombard noted a tendency to lengthen the term of temporary employment. It does appear that the average time spent in non-permanent status is increasing in all the factories and that the two older companies, usually the Badley system, have a non-permanent labor pool that is tending to become established. John Bremen has made these conclusions dependent on business cycles. During periods of rapid growth, when existing factories expand their production and new ones are opened, permanent employment becomes more quickly and easily available. The reverse happens in recessions. It is probably no coincidence that Uma Ramasamy, whose fieldwork was conducted at the time when the local textile industries had just passed through a decade of massive retrenchment, described a residual category of workers who had sometimes been registered as temporary hands for over a dozen years. They were not only much cheaper, but factory management expected them to be far more tractable, which is not surprising given the following account. There are about 70 temporary workers in mill. They were made to give their signatures on blank sheets before being taken for the work. They have to report for the work 10 minutes before the others and are sent out 10 minutes after the shift is over. The idea is to prevent them from mixing with the permanent workers. Management feared that association with permanent workers might cause discontent in them. If a temporary worker is found sitting at the back of my cycle, he would be immediately denied employment. The blank sheet with the signature would be used to write out his resignation. In general, labor productivity remains low. Management publications attribute this to worker and union militancy. What with the numerous holidays and days off, this means that a quarter to almost half of all the days in the year are, according to some sources, lost to production. But from an entirely different perspective, low productivity is also blamed on the owner's refusal to invest. Rather than technological improvement, the emphasis is on increasing productivity by intensifying the labor. Women are frequently the victims. Fearing a loss of income, they are prepared to work that is customarily carried out by men to allow themselves to be illegally included in night shifts and to work overtime without extra payment. Skilled factory work remains the preserve of only a tiny portion of the total workforce. In the recent times, surplus labor, which has acquired enormous proportion in the countryside, has looked en masse for work away from the village and agriculture. Those of this surging army of migrants who manage to reach the urban economy for shorter or longer periods are rarely able to penetrate the strongly protected bastions of the secure factory employment. And even if they are, the security of the permanent job is often beyond them. It is those fortunate enough to have such a job more influential, but might be supposed from their numbers, who have acquired a vital significance as a truly dominant class in the urban industrial landscape. To conclude, in this session, we have studied the condition of the factory workers and how it connected with the economic condition in the urban sector. In this session, we have studied the findings and the results of several studies done by Sheth, Lombard, Versulz, Holmstrom, Myers, Uma Ramasamy and other scholars. They have given the elaborate view about the factory workers and their work condition regarding the recruitment and mode of employment. Coming to the end about the factory workers, there arises a question: what are the principal social characteristics of this elite among the working population? This will be dealt in the detail in the next session. Thank you.